I'd sacrifice anything, come what might, for the sake of having you near, in spite of that lonely voice that calls in the night, says these words in my ear. Don't you know, little shmool, you never can win. Use your mentality. Wake up to reality. But each time I do, just the thought of you makes me stop before I begin. Didn't I tell you that I got you? I got you under my skin.
I'd like to thank everybody for coming. We're very excited. It's been a 3.5-year hiatus. I'm Seth Godfrey, Reference Department Manager. And I've been so glad to be part of this Democracy in America program since 2018. It's just been a great partnership with Yale Public Humanities. Thank you, Matt, and thank you, Robin, for coming. And just so pleased to getting programming going at the library again. And it's this invigoration of having discussions and folks coming back, live programming. I'm tired of Zoom, enough of it already. All right, so thank you.
Thank you.
I'm going to welcome you a second time to the library. Can you hear me? I have a kind of quiet voice. Is that right? Okay. Karen Rothman, I'm the Associate Director of Public Humanities. I work with Matt, who's the co-director with Laura Wexler. And I'm really thrilled to welcome you to this in-person reunion of the Democracy in America series, and to see so many people who were here when we were in person 4 years ago. I want to thank some people who have worked so hard to keep this series going. Louise Chavez-Brumel, the Deputy Director of the Library. Marion Huggins, the Director of the Mitchell Branch. Librarians Rory Martorona and Seth Godfrey, whom you just met, and the Public Humanities Program Manager, the awesome Jay Gagne, and also the new 10th Director of the City Libraries, Maria Bernet, whom we are thrilled to know. So during the pandemic, at each Zoom event, a member of the New Haven library staff introduced the speakers and reminded the audience that the books under discussion were available for curbside pickup. I don't know if you remember this, at every one of our Democracy in America Zoom events. And it was for me and for many people in the audience a simple nod to our physical community and a really encouraging sentence. We're here today to celebrate Dancing Down the Barricades, Sammy Davis Jr. and the Long Civil Rights Era. Published last February from the University of California Press. The book is Professor Matt Jacobson's 8th, and it follows most recently Odetta's One Grain of Sand in 2019 and The Historian's Eye, Photography, History, and the American Present in 2018, and also the classic text, his classic text, Whiteness of a Different Color, European Immigrants and the Alchemy of Race. He also served as the creator, writer, and lead researcher on the film documentary A Long Way from Home, The Untold Story of Baseball's Desegregation, which won a Golden Telly Award in 2019. He's the Sterling Professor of American Studies and History at Yale. So conversing with Matt today is Professor Robin D.G. Kelley, the Distinguished Professor and Gary B. Nash Endowed Chair in U.S. History at UCLA. And we're incredibly grateful to him for making the big trip across the country to be here inside the library. Professor Kelley is a contributing editor at the Boston Review. His essays have appeared in journals and newspapers, from American Historical Review to Social Text to New York Times, and he's an incredibly prolific writer, they both are, and has books on the history of social movements, on music, visual culture, so many topics, surrealism, Marxism. Recent books include the Thelonious Monk, The Life and Times of an American Original, and also the classic Freedom Dreams, The Black Radical Imagination, which was re-released last year in a 20th anniversary edition, and with this really beautiful foreword by Audra Monet. And alongside with that, he produced these video conversations, which are these phenomenal, really moving conversations that he conducted about the genesis and the development of that book. So obviously these are two of the most prolific, exciting, generous scholars working today, and it brings me really so much joy to return to this space with them to talk about Dancing Down the Barricades. So thank you for being here.
Thank you. That's so nice.
Thanks, everybody. Thank you for being here. It's so great to see this room full again. It's been 4 years, or 3 at least. Since not everybody in the room, you can't take for granted anymore that everyone knows Sammy Davis Jr. For those of you, especially students who might not be familiar with him, there's no overstating. We were talking about this. When Robin and I were kids, there's no overstating how famous he was. You could not turn on your television without running into Sammy Davis Jr. He desegregated the American situation comedy. He desegregated the American Western. He made Hollywood films. He was on talk shows and variety shows. He was a singer. He was a dancer. He was an actor. He was a best-selling author. He was a photographer. He was virtually everywhere. We have one more clip. As you were coming in, there was a clip of him singing a medley, which was an interesting drum and voice, which I thought was a really interesting kind of aesthetic choice on his part. That was at an all-white theater in St. Louis, the Yale Theater. What we're going to see right now is a short clip of him with the Rat Pack at Las Vegas. They're going to be singing his signature number, which was the Birth of the Blues. If you find it to be a problematic number, that's okay. It's a problematic number. But it's not as problematic as the stage show that is its setting. So this is the Rat Pack in about 1960 at the Copa Room at the Sands Hotel.
We're going to ask the audience, and we are going to join in applauding both orchestras here tonight.
I think that's swell.
Really, magnificent job.
Mr. Count Basie and the wonderful
And Quincy Jones, who conducted for me, and George Rhodes.
Stand up, ladies and gentlemen. George Rhodes. Michael Silver, stand up there. Mr. Quincy Jones directing there. Oh, you told him that? Well, you know, you have to explain it a lot because we all look alike.
Let us pray. Dearly beloved. Oh, excuse me.
Hey, could we all finish by doing one number?
May we, not can we. May we, never in the same.
May we, Sam, not can we. Fight. Oh, if I find out that's true, my heart is broken.
May we? Can we? May we?
Could we? May we?
Yes, may we? That's French.
Okay.
All right.
We can use that.
Well, what about doing a number together?
Yeah, now you're talking.
Could we do Birth of the Blues together, and each person take
Why
a little
not,
bit?
Sam?
Gee, that sounds like a swell idea. I'll get Mickey and Judy, and we'll build a barn. When's the last time you seen an Italian cut? I'm gonna cut him. You know, if he touches me one more time. He ain't got no chance.
I'd like to get out of this act, if you don't mind. I gotta catch a plane.
Yeah, want the mics closer?
You want the mics closer?
Closer.
All right.
It'll be my guess.
Then we'll just
be one.
We don't need this?
Don't need this, huh?
I thought it was separate but equal. I will start it off. It's my number. If you don't mind.
Oh, I ain't gonna fight with all your troops.
Well, I tell you, if we ever get in the lead, you two cats are first. Would you give me
No way, baby. Go ahead.
Give me a keynote, George, please.
Anybody wants, put on my track.
I'm sorry.
What you with
Okay.
a foot?
They heard...
Oh, there's a gangster sleeping upstairs. Easy.
Quiet, Sam. Subtlety, baby.
All right, sweet cakes. Oh, my goodness gracious. They...
No. The guy in the back can't hear you. Go ahead, a little more, baby. Loosen up.
They... You may be my leader, but I'm gonna punch you right in your mouth. Oh, that's better. All right.
I gotta catch a train sooner, yeah.
What are you complaining about? I gotta go to a bar mitzvah in a minute. They heard the breeze through the trees, singing weird melodies, and they named that the start of the blues.
And from a jail came away from a down-hearted frail, and they call that the start of the blues. From a whippoorwill high on a hill.
How about that?
They took a new note. Oh, shut in a horn till it was born. I'll call you if I need you. Till it's a blue note. Get off the stage. And then they nursed it. And they rehearsed it.
How does it feel to sit in the back of the bus?
Then I gave out the news that the Southland really gave birth.
Let's give Dean a chance.
Shut up. Safe? 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 Am I safe? I'm safe. Stuck it in the hole. Forced it in a nut. Stuck it. Go on. It's good.
Everybody, they nursed it.
They rehearsed it.
And they gave out the news. That the Southland gave birth to the blues. They nursed it, rehearsed it, and gave out the news. That the Southland gave birth to the blues.
Okay, so we begin.
Please.
Okay, well, welcome everybody. Can you hear me in the back? Okay, because we have no microphones or anything. You can't? No. Okay, well, I will try to shout. We had microphones, but they don't work. So we will do the best we can. Yeah, this seat's up in the front, if you want. Okay. Okay, so I will try to do the best I can. So before we begin our conversation, if you will indulge me, I just want to make a few, remarks about the book. And by the way, I kind of know what it's like to be Sammy Davis Jr. because I just flew from Cape Town, South Africa yesterday. So like 20 hours, and then flew Atlanta up here, then drove from JFK to New Haven on mustard sandwiches, right? So I mean, to be on the road, so I'm a little bit worn out. I don't have Sammy's energy, but I'll do the best I can. This book, by the way, is really a kind of a landmark achievement. And it's kind of hard to do because, Sammy Davis Jr. is someone about whom many people have written. There's a major biography. He's written 2 autobiographies himself. So, what is there to say? But Matt has a lot to say. Because it's a book about both the world that Sammy Davis Jr., that made Sammy Davis Jr., the world that Sammy Davis Jr. made in many ways, the world that he imagined could be if things were different, and also the world from which he was alienated, And I think that what you do actually for Sammy Davis Jr. is very similar to what Farrah Griffin does for Billie Holiday. And by the way, her book, If You Can't Be Free, Be a Mystery, is really a classic. It's a beautiful book. And I think that you raise the stakes in the same way that she does that. But I have to say, no one should leave here without the book. It doesn't make sense. And you should read it cover to cover. I will say that it was very sad for me in many ways. Because it's not like, it's like there's a lot of things that are familiar, because as Matt said, we both kind of grew up. I mean, I grew up with Sammy Davis Jr. in the later part of his career, in the 60s and 70s, but it's like he wasn't really loved fully, more like a wind-up toy, and you saw it in the clip where, he's the butt of many jokes. And I listened to the interviews with David Frost, which are really pretty astounding, and he says at one point that his biggest regret is that he never went to school. Not once did he step inside of a classroom, and we'll get to that. He joked about, he went on stage at age 3. By age 6, he realized that he was working. It wasn't a game. So imagine what it means for your mother to leave when you're very, very young, and for your father and your kind of, play uncle or the employer to basically extract labor from you your whole life, And I want to emphasize that unlike someone like Harry Belafonte, for example, or even Sidney Poitier, Sammy Davis Jr. never had any other job but being on stage. He never had any other job. That was his job from childhood. So the idea of him, he couldn't be recruited into the Communist Party, if he wanted to, because he didn't even have the kind of public, natural life that you could have. So this is a real factor. I would love to talk more about this. And just a couple more things. The kind of brutal racism that he faced, which is beautifully documented in the book, as well as the rejection that he got from black people, meant that he was incredibly isolated, let alone the racism that he experienced from his friends. So this particular clip that we saw wasn't as bad as other moments. Like is that? Okay.
It's okay.
Oh, good. Yeah. I'm about to say, the whole place is about to go. But if you, when you read the book, it's a trigger warning. When you get to the 1975 Dean Martin's roast of Sammy, I'm just saying you're going to be triggered, because the kind of racism that he experienced from these people was incredible. And the fact that anyone even laughed, watermelon jokes, Klan jokes, in 1975 from the liberals. And you expect that from Don Rickles, but it was like Don Rickles was even worse.
Yeah.
I mean, Don Rickles came off as kind of liberal compared to Milton Berle and Dean Martin. I mean, it was really deep. And I grew up watching, Dean Martin's Laugh-In, and the whole way that, Sammy Davis Jr. played Pigmeat Markham's role. In any case, so much of the book is dealing with race, okay? So I want to sort of begin with this question. It's kind of a two-part question. What brought you to this project, knowing that you spent most of your life writing about race?
Yeah.
But what brought you to this project? And number two, correct me if I'm wrong, but my takeaway is that Sammy Davis Jr. constantly thought about race. That no matter what he said about waking up and having to be reminded that he's black, he's a Negro, it's like he never, ever stopped thinking about it, that he was not living in a colorblind fantasy, no matter what people think. And he never played it down. Even though he tolerated certain things, race was always present in a way that it wasn't even always present. I wrote a book about Monk in the same way, but for Sammy Davis. So those two things, what brought you to the topic, and what do you think about, how do you think about how he thinks about race?
Yeah, thank you for that. So this project has a strange trajectory. It started as a piece of a larger project. It was going to be a cultural history of the civil rights era, the long civil rights era, from basically the 40s to the 70s. and it had different chapters, each one of which focused on a different figure. It caught a different political mood, a different political moment. Some of the other figures include Odetta, which I ended up writing a book about. There was a chapter on the segregation and desegregation of baseball, which I ended up making a film about. There was a chapter on the comedian Dick Gregory, which I'm now working on a book about. So the pieces kept flying out and becoming their own thing, and that's where the Sammy piece actually came from. He was a particular challenge to me because his art is not my art, and his politics are not my politics, and so living with him was not easy for me. But because of what you're saying about his attention to race and the ways he was both trapped by it, but just constantly feeling like he could find his way out of it. I mean, he's kind of a tragic figure in that way. He's always convinced. I mean, I love what you said about he never had the opportunity to become a member of the Communist Party because he never had a job. You know, but in the context of first the vaudeville stage and then the nightclub circuit and then the Vegas, in that kind of showbiz context, the best he could do to fight racism was to just be better. And he was convinced that talent was his best weapon and that if he just was a little bit better, he could lick this thing. And you're right, I mean, he was obsessed with race, even as much as he talked about being colorblind and as much as he talked about race not mattering. It mattered every single day in his life in different ways, and he kept running up against it no matter what he did.
And much of what he did break with convention. You know, I mean, we don't, and I think this is a very important part of the book, I love the comment on it, is, you know, we think sometimes that trying to integrate or enter into those spaces that were white spaces somehow is like a sellout. It's only a sellout after the fact, but in the moment, it's not a sellout at all. And the fact that he even pushed his father and Mr. Maston around moving beyond the vaudeville colored show that they've been doing was really quite bold of him at the time, but that's not what he's remembered for. He's remembered for the white women. We'll get to that, but talk about what you found in doing the research about the way that he, you know, he takes the title, Dancing Down the Barricades, and the way that he would dance down the barricades to a certain degree, but then enter into and be surrounded by all kinds of barricades at the time. But can you talk about, like, what are the things that you found that where he really kind of broke new ground, and what were the consequences for that?
Well, that's one of the supreme ironies of his life, is that as far as he was concerned, he was breaking down barriers everywhere he went, but he was thought to be someone who wanted to be white. He was thought to be someone who was kind of self-loathing. He had a kind of assimilationist personal style or social style that was, I think, misunderstood a lot. So he became associated with the white spaces that, as far as he was concerned, these were incursions on his part. He was doing the work of breaking down barriers to be you know, to be in that Las Vegas stage show. Like, that was a piece of integrationist barrier breaking work. But look what it turned into, and that was the kind of irony of everything he did. And one of the tropes of the book, well, so Dancing Down the Barricades has two different meanings. One is dancing them down, and the other is simply dancing down them. And I think that the question is which is which, and what did he actually accomplish? And that was kind of the question of his career. He was criticized from all sides for trying to dance down the barricades, and I think he was often misunderstood. I think his politics were misunderstood. But he brought a lot of that on himself by some of the choices he made as well.
No, I thought it's striking how, you know, despite the assumption that he was trying to just assimilate and become white, with the exception of the conch, I don't know if you're familiar with conching, is like straightening your hair. And there was a point in his life in the 70s when he stopped doing it. Everyone was doing it for the most part in that period, but he kept doing it for a long time. So except for that, it's amazing how he always spoke pretty much in a kind of black vernacular. He referred to people as baby, you know. That's like a black thing. Step and Fetch It had an affected English accent. Like when he wasn't on stage, you know, and Charlie, you probably know this, right? Because you study this stuff. But it's like, how do we square? Oh, and one other thing, that in just about every single role Sammy Davis Jr. was played, film, television, it was always a racialized role, whether it's a black role or something similar, but it was always racialized in a way. So the idea that somehow he was trying to, he couldn't even create a kind of colorblind casting, and he went for those roles. I mean,
he did, and he had a really sophisticated theory about casting, which was way ahead of his time. I mean, casting in the post-civil rights era and after got much more attention and thought, you know, but and this is one of the things that I think was mistaken for assimilationism on his part, but he asked the question, you know, if there's just a role that isn't racialized, then why can't a black person have it? If the role itself is not written as black, then why can't a black person hold it? And it's both, I mean, one of the conundrums of the Hollywood especially, but television also, the whole kind of entertainment apparatus was there's hiring questions and there's representation questions. Right. And what often worked well as representation didn't work well as hiring, and vice versa. And some of the efforts to desegregate the screen led to some of the most racist representations there are. And some of the efforts to rid the screen of racist representations turned into horrible hiring practices that actually were quite exclusionary. And Davis was kind of running afoul of that, but he was theorizing it. He was really trying to think his way through it, which is one of the reasons why the Western was so interesting to him. He knew that there were black cowboys. He knew that the actual historical West was multiracial, multivocal, and he had a real interest in it. And he wanted the screen to depict that. But this was in a period where, I mean, it's become iconic. I mean, just how white the West of the Hollywood Western was.
Exactly. But you said something that's very important. There's a difference between saying, I want to play a cowboy because a cowboy is colorblind. He's like saying, no, there were way more black people who were in this role than you've even, you know, he had books, he studied the question.
Right, no, I mean, there are places where to be a cowboy was to be black. Right. I mean, that was just the meaning of the term in certain areas.
Exactly. And when you talked about how he lobbied to play Sporting Life and Porgy and Bess, there's something both sad about it, but also, again, he's lobbying to play a role, to make it his own, that he identifies as an authentically black role. You know, I mean, for all the problems with Porgy and Bess, he tries to bring something to it, you know. Can you talk about the impact that, especially in terms of putting forward his career and the impact that it had, you know, this, when he played Sporting Life?
Well, he rewrote the part in a really interesting way. I mean, John Bubbles had played it in the earlier versions, and I mean, it's hard to talk about Porgy and Bess because it's such a problematic text in so many of its dimensions. I mean, it's a representational nightmare, actually. But Davis had some interesting ideas about how to play the evil that was Sporting Life and how to be kind of serpentine in his self-presentation. There's also a really important moment in his song about going to New York. There's some code switching where he's singing it in this kind of urbane style that is all kind of dripping syrupy, kind of serpentine, snake-like. He's basically, I mean, he's duping Bess into a life that is ugly in many ways, and he's saying, "Come with me." There's a moment in the song when he sings, I can't remember exactly the line, but it's a line about going to New York, and he sings it straight. It's not in the serpentine voice that is the rest of the song. And it comes out being a kind of counter to what Porgy and Bess was a kind of anti-Great Migration
Right.
song about, you know, the African Americans should stay put in the South, they should stay where they are. And the distant city, which in the earlier iterations of it was Charleston, but in this version it's New York. But the distant city is a kind of siren song that can only mean trouble. But the way he sings that song, it really remarks New York as an actual destination, which is, I mean, he's a product of the Great Migration himself. His both Uncle Will Maston and his father and his dancing mother were all products of the Great Migration, and he grew up. He was born the same year as well, he was born at the height of the Harlem Renaissance, and that was the kind of milieu that he grew up in. And so I think there's a subtle kind of paean to the Great Migration, kind of embedded in his version of that song.
Right. No, this issue of Sammy Davis Jr.'s quest to be bigger. He's always saying, he even said this to Eartha Kitt, I'm going to be great, I'm going to be more famous than you. But the idea that you solve the problem of alienation and racism by being bigger and bigger and bigger. And he mentioned that, but I wanted to share one story that really touched him. And when I read it, it was like it'll make you cry. And it involves Burt Williams. And everyone knows Burt Williams is the great comedic actor. He did so-called blackface at the time, but it's a time when all black actors had to do that. I mean, he was really a star, incredibly talented. And then I can't remember who he's with. You remember when he goes to the bar, and he's with this white guy, and this is not in the South. And he sits at the bar, and they ask for whiskeys, and so they put the whiskeys down, the bartender, and he says to the white dude, "That'd be 50 cents." And then he says to Burt Williams, "That'd be $100. He pulls out 4 $100 bills, puts them on the counter, and says, "I'll take 4. Now, the fact that he can do that speaks to something that Sammy Davis Jr. says, that that the benefit of being famous is that I could be Jim Crowed in the biggest places, But could you imagine what it means to save your dignity by putting down $400 for 4 shots of whiskey as a way to make a point? And so having said that, I really want you to share and meditate on what that story meant for Sammy Davis Jr. and what that means for understanding the ceiling that he keeps bumping into as he gets bigger and bigger and bigger.
Yeah. The turning point for him in those lines is his years in the Army. He gets sent to a fort in Wyoming during the war. And he ends up with Special Services, which is like kind of a USO entertainment outfit. And I mean, at the time, USO shows were minstrel shows. Complete with blackface and burnt cork. I mean, that was just the standard. And these books, you can still find them. These 1940s government issue entertainment books. Like, here's how you put on a show. First, you get your burnt cork, and then you black up your face, and there's the N-man, and there are different characters that have to be played, and there are different dialects that need to be used, and so that's the world that he entered. But what he found was, and he was running afoul of his white comrades in arms all the time. He was getting beat up. His stories are quite harrowing, the stories from life in the Army. But what he found was that moment on the stage was the moment when he could break it down, and he could win their acceptance, and which is a problematic formulation anyway. I mean, that was the problem that the civil rights generation had with him. He was always trying to deserve acceptance rather than insisting on it. So there was a political valence to it. But he became convinced in his Army years that if he was just good enough, if he was just big enough, that he could win over these white toughs who were otherwise beating him up. And that became the kind of kernel of the way he approached entertainment from that point on. And that quest to become bigger In part, it was a quest to break down barriers and to play places like the Copacabana or the Sands Hotel, and to actually do the political work of desegregating these white spaces. But part of it was just an effort to be bigger, to be bigger, to be bigger. And his autobiography, Yes, I Can, is plagued by this kind of undercurrent of every time he has these triumphs that he thinks, this is the moment, I've made it, and I finally have this thing beat. There's always some comeuppance afterward. So he'll have a big triumph, and then he'll be turned away from getting a table at a restaurant, or he'll be refused service at a hotel, or whatever or a doorman will slight him, or whatever the thing is. But there's lurking around the next bend. There's always another racial slight, no matter what he does. And so, Yes, I Can ends up being a book about No, You Can't. And it's that tension is palpable in the book, and it's really quite a tragic volume in that sense.
Right, and it's clear that that's an argument that he's making, that there's something that's intractable about racism. But those of us who are in academia know it's no different. Like we go through life. I know I went through my whole life trying to prove, to all these people who turn out to be pretty mediocre scholars after all, that we belong. It's like the imposter syndrome of constantly producing, and no matter what happens, there's still like a lack of recognition, or there's that's good for my advisor with my dissertation said, like, wouldn't write me a letter of recommendation, and I got a job anyway. And then he said, you got a job? I said, yeah, I got a job. He says, and he said to me that it's a lot easier for a mediocre black historian to get a job than a good white labor historian. And this is like 1987. So all I'm saying is that the world that he lives in is the world that basically every black professional has to deal with.
And it doesn't go away.
It doesn't.
I won't call it a hidden agenda, but one of the things that's going on in this book, and in a sense, this is my Donald Trump book. This is the book where I'm trying to work out, like, how could the society that voted for Barack Obama on one election cycle vote for Donald Trump on the next? And it's that doubleness, that taffy pull between the racism and anti-racism that's at the heart of Yes, I Can, is kind of what the book is about. And what it's referring to really are things that are happening right now.
Right. So speaking of racism, anti-racism, okay, now this is a philosophical question. So throughout the book, in certain parts, you're in conversation. In some ways, Sammy Davis Jr. is in conversation with James Baldwin. And at one point, you say, he's almost the anti-Baldwin. I love the almost, because at first, I thought of Baldwin as his foil, like the negation of Sammy Davis Jr. But as I continued reading and thinking about Baldwin's commentary, he is more or less Davis's conscience.
Yes.
Right? But then Davis is in some ways Baldwin's conscience, or perhaps his unconscious, or even his demons. So talk about James Baldwin in this woven through. And Baldwin's kind of obsessed with Sammy Davis Jr.
He is. Well, and they knew each other, and they came from exactly the same place at the same time, and they just end up, it's kind of fascinating. The way I came to Baldwin in this project, it had to do with Baldwin's writings about the big black Hollywood productions in the 1950s, including, some of which, we talked about Porgy and Bess, but there were a whole cycle of them, Carmen Jones, Porgy and Bess, Ana Lu Costa, and Baldwin wrote a lot about them, really critically, really sharp, really quite brilliant writing, some of the best critical film writing I know of, like really compelling. You can Google it, you can find his stuff. That's how I started thinking about Baldwin, was in the context of Porgy and Bess. But I became interested in that connection because they do come from the same place. And in fact, they end up sitting next to each other at Martin Luther King's funeral. Their paths keep crossing in these really interesting ways. But I like what you're saying. Well, I'm glad that you appreciate the almost, because it is simply almost. He's not the anti-Baldwin.
Right.
Although they do end up in very different places.
Yeah, but then also they end up, in terms of interracial relationships, I was really struck. I mean, because there's a chapter, again, a harrowing, all the chapters are kind of harrowing, so you need to sit down and read the book. And what's beautiful is that it's woven through long histories, from the 19th century to the present. So we are able, so Matt beautifully situates Sammy Davis Jr. Within a long trajectory in these chapters. So I want to talk to you about this interracial marriage thing, because, of course, Davis is not the first prominent black person to marry a white woman. Frederick Douglass, was even more famous in some ways. Although for Davis, being married after World War II seemed to be way more dangerous than, in other words, more dangerous to do that in 1960 than 1860. And we could talk about why that's the case. But I want to go back to connect this to Baldwin. Baldwin had this great line where he's debating this whole question about miscegenation. He says, you're not worried about me marrying your daughter. Because the Southern racists will be like, I don't want you Negroes marrying my daughter. So he says, you're not worried about me marrying your daughter. You're worried about me marrying your wife's daughter. I've been marrying your daughter ever since the days of slavery. Now dig that. For those of you who are slow, it means that interracial relationships, interracial sex between white men and black women through forced sex or whatever was common. And that's why you have all these so-called mulattoes all over the South. So given that, how do we think about Sammy Davis Jr.'s defense? Both his defense, but also the way that he ends up being sort of outcast in the black community for some of these relationships. And, because
it was his peculiar fate that, so he did this stage show, a Broadway show in 1964 called The Golden Boy. It was a reworking of Clifford Odets' play from the 1930s about a boxer. In this version, they make the boxer black, which makes the love interest in the play an interracial romance, which is what the 1964 version ends up being about. It ends up being all about race, even though the original wasn't.
Right.
It's Davis's peculiar fate to run afoul of the KKK for doing that. And there's an interracial kiss. It's the first interracial kiss on Broadway, and it usually brought boos from the white audience. People booed at the moment of the kiss. There's also a moment where the white love interest rejects the black boxer, and that often brought applause from the white audience. Obviously, that was not the intention of the play, but that's what happened. But he runs afoul of the KKK while they're in rehearsals in 1964, and he runs afoul of the Black Panthers when they're traveling with the show in 1966. And it's the love interest, the love choices made that are being depicted in the play are upsetting to people on all sides of the question. And that was something that he lived with, from the 50s onward.
Right. And that was 1964, right?
Well, that was 64, but I'm
thinking
of his own personal relationships. Starting in the 50s.
But the fact that the show opens in 64 around the time of Freedom Summer, which is a classic moment of interracial relations. Which I think is interesting. But go ahead.
Yeah. But he, his interest in interracial romance was deeply seated. It was deeply seated in his own experience. He had a lot of white girlfriends and he had a white wife after 1960. He dated a lot of white women in the 50s. It was seen as a betrayal in many parts of the black community. It was seen, obviously, it earned him encounters with the Ku Klux Klan throughout the 1950s and bomb threats, and he had to travel with a security detail. It was a really harrowing time, including he was dating Kim Novak at one point, and her studio threatened him physically. They said they were going to break his legs if he didn't break it off with her.
And then he'd also poke out his other eye.
And poke out his other eye, that's right. And because his blackness was destroying her property and whiteness, basically.
Right. It's, you know, I'm an old person, and so I've seen a lot of stuff, but it still shocks me how much energy the Nazis and the Klan put into attacking Sammy Davis Jr. over his marriage to Mae Britt. I mean, it takes a lot of time to do a bomb threat, to organize a rally, to send hate mail, to organize a rally again, to threaten. It's like you got other things to do over this one relationship, you know? So I just think it's kind of, what's I think really powerful about the book too is, whether it's intended or not, the pathology of racism is on display. And Sammy Davis Jr. actually comes out looking pretty good. You know, I mean, in other words, his defense of his relationship feels really authentic.
Yes.
You know, in that, because he's actually pushing back against the idea that all he does is chase white women, but at the same time saying, like when he gets asked the question, I guess, at the press conference and goes to London to announce it, and gets asked, like, what about what if baby comes out black? And he's like, I don't care if it comes out polka dot or whatever, we're gonna love the child. And the fact that a journalist is gonna ask that question in England, I think is really fascinating.
Yeah, and in his autobiography, he says, I didn't ask Mae Britt to intermarry me.
Right.
I just asked her to marry me. And like, he's very clear-eyed about that in a certain way.
Right. Before we leave Golden Boy,
Yes.
you've got to talk about the soundtrack, specifically Don't Forget 127th Street. Can you talk more about that? Because I was shocked when I looked at the lyrics, when I listened to the song.
So it's one of those things, I can't remember all of them, but
I have them all here.
Oh, you have them all here.
Right.
So read them out.
So
they spell out Harlem. H is for the, A is for the, R is for the.
I'm going to read all of them because they're so interesting. So the character Ronnie, I think played by Johnny Brown, is, you know, telling him to remember, don't forget 127th Street. So he says, don't forget your happy home, your happy Harlem home. There's no slum like your own. Remember winter evenings at that window. Watch those evictions in the snow. Oh no, Joe, don't forget 127th Street. Don't forget the cultural life on this here street, richer than the outside world suspects. Hark the cheerful patter of all the junkies' feet in the soothing tones of Malcolm X. Each night we hasten to our spotless subway. Riding home is always such a treat. Oh no, Joe, don't forget our beautiful old ancestral home. An angel called it Harlem, called 127th Street. Remember the moonlight on the Harlem River and the cops all strolling 2 by 2. Oh no, Joe, don't forget 127th Street, whatever you may do. And the women all chime in, you know, here where you were born and raised and fed, as a nice little baby, you always smiled so sweet when the falling plaster hit your head. And Joe says, sure, when I'm driving, Joe is Sammy Davis Jr.'s character, the boxer. When I'm driving in my big Ferrari with some luscious rich chick as my pet, believe me, how I'll miss this beautiful 127th Street. I'll miss it every chance I get. Don't forget our glorious PS42 with 90 kids in every class, radiators full of ice all winter though. Man, oh man, you'll really freeze your. H is for the heroin they sell here. A is for the alleys where kids play. R is for the rats that run pell-mell here. L is for the landlords far away. E is for the endless cleanup projects. M is for the moldy rooms above. Put them all together, they spell Harlem, the place that white folks think we love. Now, and there's a little bit more now, but that's deep. And what's interesting is that the music does not go with the lyrics. The music is kind of sappy and terrible.
It's upbeat and
yeah, it's terrible. I mean, whoever composed it just wasn't thinking. But the lyrics on stage, in the way that even invoking Malcolm X. So you have a lot to say about the song in the book. Could you?
Yeah, well, I mean, it's, you know, in some ways, The Distant Landlord is the return of the repressed, because what the song does, it kind of pins all of the ills of Harlem on the black community itself and makes it a place to escape from. So it's a song about abandonment, but kind of righteous abandonment in a way. The politics of it, I think, are quite creepy. It dodges the kind of policy questions, and I mean, in that line, the place that white people think we like, or the place that white people think we love. There's just a lot of displacement going on. Displacement of the actual historical forces that account for the social conditions that are being described, and a displacement of the actual politics that might make things better.
Yeah. On the other hand, which is why the lyrics are so interesting, that is all true. Plus, then we turn to Lorraine Hansberry in Raising the Sun, where she says, where she gets criticized because the family wants to move out of the ghetto. And she says to the critics, where do you think they lived before? Like, under those circumstances, you don't think they want to leave. And the same thing with, if you read Frank London Brown's book, and I got old age now. He writes this book about the projects in Chicago, and it opens up with a baby falling from kind of a hole in the kind of the wall of the house and dies. And so even though the conditions themselves are the products of slumlords, of capital, of all that stuff, there's something about the assumption that black people love living there.
Yeah.
And that's the thing that I think is like you say, it's complicated, you know?
Yeah. And the social geography, his relationship with Harlem is kind of all spun together with his relationship with women, white and black, as well. And there's a social geography that underlies the play that is very complicated and at the end of the day, not very complimentary to the black community.
Right. We're going to open for questions, but just two more questions. One has to do with Miles Davis. And I have to say, I thought a lot about Miles and Sammy, the other Davis, because, you know, especially A Man Called Adam, where he plays a jazz musician, is very much modeled off of Miles.
Yes.
And then and then also at the end of at the end of The Golden Boy, right? He dies in a car accident. He has his Ferrari he's driving with.
Yes.
And that's a Miles movie. Though Miles doesn't die, but Miles, he's driving his Ferrari, gets shot up by gangsters. You know, am I crazy to think that in many ways Miles is another kind of alter ego for Sammy Davis Jr., and yet understood as the complete opposite?
Yes.
And yet there's something about every time you have complete opposites, there's a kind of dialectical relationship which are locked together.
Yeah.
What are your thoughts about?
That's really interesting, and I think that Sammy was drawn to Miles, which is why he wanted to play him in that. But he has to kill him off.
Right.
The Miles Davis character can't live. He's not allowed to live at the end of that film, and I think that that's significant for Davis.
Right.
I think that they did come to represent two kind of polar opposites on the American spectrum of assimilationism and pluralism. And in fact, I make a kind of shorthand reference to that. Assimilation, Sammy, pluralism, Miles.
Right.
And I think, that kind of works to a certain extent. But I do think that, and it goes back to your Baldwin question in a certain way. Baldwin expatriates, and that's something that Davis never does. But there's something about Davis's insistence on staying and his insistence on inhabiting white spaces is the thing that kind of sets him apart from both Baldwin and Miles Davis in a certain way.
Right. Yeah, and at the same time, Miles, there's a way in which Miles inhabited white spaces. He's just not perceived that way.
Right.
I mean, it's just that he inhabited white spaces without apology.
On his own terms.
On his own terms.
On his own terms.
You know,
right.
on his own, and then there's some really interesting, again, relationships with white women early on in his life. Anyway, that's just my thinking about it. The last question just has to do with, I could talk to you all day about this, about Yes, I Can. What's really important is that you talk about the book, and by the way, the book is, I guess, completed in 1962, right? And there's some issues, it doesn't come out to 65.
Right.
So the timing is not good.
The timing is
terrible.
Because it's the book that when Stokely Carmichael's Black Power comes out, that's going to eclipse the entire social vision of Yes, I Can, like in a second.
Right.
Yes, I Can becomes obsolete. By 1966, it just comes out in 1965.
Yeah. But he's struggling in Yes, I Can to deal with the racism in a way that some of the other writers are not necessarily doing. But then it's back to back with the Alex Haley interview for Playboy magazine. So here's my question. What do you think would have happened if Alex Haley wrote
Yes, I Can?
Yes, I Can, instead of the Boyars? Of course, Alex Haley likes to plagiarize, but but if Alex Haley had been the ghostwriter, how do you think? I mean, this is asking you to speculate, but how do you think the book would be different, other than the Boyars?
Well, Yes, I Can. It's really important that the two co-writers that Davis was working with were white. And so their conversations across the color line are really integral to the way that book takes shape. And there's a way in which it's written for a white audience because the things that are shocking about it would only shock a white person. And that's kind of who it's aimed for, and it's meant to shock. It's meant to say, look at this person who's so deserving, and look at how poorly he's treated. Like that's not a surprise to Harlem.
And just to be clear, it's white liberals.
White liberals. Right.
Very different machine.
I think that Davis had a hand in that, but I think the Boyars had a hand in that too. And I think it was the collaboration between the three of them is what really accounts for that kind of political texture of the book. That would be different. Right.
Because you talk about the questions that Alex Haley pushes him on a lot of things.
Pushes him, but it's also after Black Power comes out.
Right.
I mean, I don't know what questions. Another question to ask is, what would that interview look like if it had taken place in 1965 rather than 1966?
Yeah, but he just done Malcolm X's autobiography.
That's true.
That's and Malcolm, of course, comes from a different place, but.
But Haley famously was trying to tone down some of that text as well.
Right.
And make it more assimilationist. Actually.
Right. But there's that one moment you write about, which I think is really important, where, and again, I'm not going to give away too much of the book because you're going to buy it anyway. But there's this great moment where Sammy Davis Jr. says, what they need to do is basically get some guns and shoot off all those Opes who, are killing our people in the South. Sammy Davis Jr. and Alex Haley's like, what? Like, do you really mean that? Like retaliation? And he had to pull back. I mean, Sammy Davis Jr. had to pull back on that. Yeah. And he didn't pull back all the way either, know?
No. Yeah, he was, I don't know what to say about that, actually. Because in a general way, like if you think about one of the trajectories here, that he's completely enmeshed in, there's this slow kind of glacial shift in American political culture, at least in mainstream and white discourse. There's this shift between kind of the bigotry model and the racism model of understanding racism. The bigotry model is it's individualized, it's psychologized, it's one-off, it's the bigot, it's the hateful comment, And that's where Sammy lived. Like
Right.
that's how he wrote about it. And he wrote
Right.
about a world where bigots were the problem.
Right.
And by the time Black Power comes out,
It's
it's
structural.
much more structural. It's
Right.
systemic. It's not just individuals. You can re-educate all the individuals, and you'd still have the
Right.
same rotten system. And for the most part, Davis never embraces that
Right.
view. So it's kind of puzzling why he makes this comment about arming up, you
Right.
know, and going
It's
south.
it's interesting. Okay, now we have time. I said 45 minutes exactly. We're right on time. Yes.
Hey, Robin.
Hey, how you doing? It's good seeing you. Oh my goodness, it's not Frank.
Let's get into religion. And what about Altavis Davis, Lola Falana, Diane Carroll, all the ways that
Yes.
she's mentoring and nurturing other Black performers?
Yes,
Yeah.
that's also in the book. You could talk about that. It's in the book too.
Yeah. Wait. So I'm sorry. What was the first one?
Religion.
Oh, religion. Yeah. So
Yeah.
he converts to Judaism, which is important and controversial and interesting. His commentary on it is even more interesting, though, because I think that for most people, black and white, his conversion to Judaism was part of his wanting to be white or wanting to be closer to the white community.
Mm-hmm.
But the way he talks about Judaism is much more, it's a template for the black community to think about
Right.
kind of self-care.
Mhm.
And so in his view, the way Jews for thousands of years have responded to anti-Semitism is actually a model for African Americans responding to racism. Right. And so you can't really pry apart race and religion in the way that most people do in their assumptions about what Judaism meant to him.
And this is after his accident.
After his accident, and right, and it's Eddie Cantor who, Eddie Cantor is the one who I think was with...
with Burt Williams.
With Burt Williams. Yeah. But it's Eddie Cantor who plays a key role in Davis's conversion. After his car accident, he gives him a mezuzah, which is a kind of talisman. It's a piece of Torah scripture encased, and that becomes a very significant object for Davis,
Right.
and it becomes symbolic of, for him, a different way of thinking about difference and a different way of thinking about self-regard and fighting back.
Right. And then nurturing of other actors coming up.
Yeah, well, so Altavis Davis, Lola Falana, I mean, one of the interesting things, like Davis does this Broadway show in 1956 called Mr. Wonderful, and it's an integrated show, and he's very proud of that at the time. Although there's a set piece that's a kind of tribute to Al Jolson, who was the last of the great blackface performers. So it's a problematic show, and it's something that Davis atones for the rest of his life. And in a way, Golden Boy is a chance for a do-over. It's a chance to really do an integrated production. But and Lola Falana is working with him through these years, and she really saw him as someone who was, I mean, and this was controversial because not everyone saw him as someone who was a benefit to the community at large.
Right.
But Lola Falana did, and talks about him that way,
Right.
and kind of tips her hat to him.
Right.
I don't know if that's an answer to your question or not.
Yeah. We have to talk. Anyone else? Yes.
Yeah, I have a question for
Go.
you. So you mentioned Miles Davis. I have a question about Louis Armstrong.
Uh-huh.
Do you see him as same side of the coin or are they different? There were polar opposites because there were social nomads too. I mean, black people were suspicious of Louis, and the white people really didn't accept him as fully as he had imagined in his mind. So do you think Louis and Sammy are on the same side of the street?
Well, you know, it's fascinating because Louis Armstrong appears in
Hello, Doc.
Man Called Adam.
Man
Called
Adam as a kind of Louis Armstrong figure,
Character, yeah.
as a kind of, well, a has-been, basically, is the way he's presented. Like, his day is over, his kind of music is over, his day in show business is over. He's kind of a grandfatherly figure. There's some real ironies here, because in a way, Davis ends up being that figure, especially as far as the civil rights generation was concerned. But on the other hand, Davis was quite critical of Armstrong. I think it was in 1957.
Yeah, the Little Rock.
58,
Yeah.
around, yes,
Yeah.
that's right, it was around Little Rock.
Right.
And Armstrong made some comments that Davis was very critical of. He was also critical of some things in the Armstrong repertoire in terms of I think it was Armstrong used the word darky in a song lyric, and
Right.
Davis was offended by that and thought he should have changed it in 1957 or 58 or whatever it was. So I think both things are true in a weird way with Armstrong.
Yeah.
I'm sorry to interrupt. Thank you.
Hey, Daphne.
Hey, how you doing, Robin?
I'm okay. I'm okay. I said we can't start without you anyway.
Oh, please. No, just, thank you, sir, for bringing up Louis Armstrong. I mean, Louis Armstrong was also a deep intellectual trickster.
Yes.
Yes.
In ways that Sam Davis never was.
Right.
So maybe just think more about like the limits or the ways in which we can understand Sammy Davis's intellectualism or lack thereof. Since
He was very literal.
Of him not going to school. Not to say that there aren't other forms of intellectualism, which
Right.
Jan Winter doesn't seem to know anything about. But if you want to say something.
Yeah, no, Davis was he was a literal thinker. He was too literal. He was too literal to be a trickster, and he spoke that way. He wrote that way. He puzzled out social problems that way.
Right.
He thought about social conditions that way.
Right. He was amazingly transparent too, because like when you listen to those David Frost, he did 5 interviews with David Frost. I think only 3 were actually released, I believe. But in those interviews, he is very direct and transparent about how he feels about things. He doesn't have, it's just like this doesn't feel like there's artifice there.
Right.
But the thing about Little Rock, which is so interesting, is that Louis Armstrong was almost by himself among entertainers who took a stand against Eisenhower, against Governor Faubus. I mean, of course, people like Mingus and others did. But the fact that Louis Armstrong got criticized roundly by people, including Sammy Davis Jr., it's not even like, they're not defending Eisenhower, they're just mad at him for saying, I feel like I don't have a country, and I'm not going to do those tours anymore for the State Department. It was a quite radical, forthright position to take, and all Sammy Davis Jr. could say in response is that, I don't like the fact you play segregated audiences,
Right.
I don't like the fact you have darky in your song, and had no real political response, right? And yet that's the same Sammy Davis Jr. who, because of his relationship to Mae Britt, ends up being kind of pushed out of the Kennedy camp, which you talk
Right.
about. You know, could talk about that.
Yeah, I mean, this book ends up being a lot about liberalism in a way, and that was one of the moments when Kennedy, because of the marriage to Mae Britt, Kennedy thought it was too dangerous to be close to Davis, or to even be seen to be close to Davis, and he disinvites him from the inaugural ball. And Davis never really gets over it, and
Right.
to the extent that that's one of the things that helps explain the famous hug of Richard Nixon years later, is Davis was kind of decoupled from the Democratic Party at that moment.
Right. That was a bad movie.
This has been a totally delightful conversation. I want to give a couple details, and then I would love to hear you talk about gender.
Yes.
You know, that incredible anecdote that Dr. Kelley told about tossing the $100 bills at the table, the invocation of the guns, the literalism, watching that video. This just are boys, laddishness, just not wisdom, maturity. There's something really about being not mature that seems kind of important to the story. So I just would love to hear how you, because I think some of your discomfort, you said it's sitting with it, is that's not a gender formation that's really fun to be around as an adult person, but it is a way of trying to retain youthful vitality, especially with the kind of white masculinity that he was most put up against. So I'm just struck by the immaturity of Sammy Davis' affective performance and what that might have to do with his gender.
Yeah, I mean, people have kind of thought about it as a piece of his assimilationism, was assimilation into what? And the into what was this kind of playboy culture of I mean, the womanizing and the boys will be boys and the raucousness of I mean, the Rat Pack really just captures all of that. I mean, it kind of distills it to its purest and ugliest form in a way. But that was Davis's life writ large for many years. Like, he really was part of that world. And I think, you know, there are different ways to think about it, and obviously smarter people than me have written on these questions, but the ways in which womanizing can stand in for liberation, you know, the ways in which race and gender are imbricated in a way that makes certain choices appealing, but makes them stand in for other choices, those kinds of things. I mean, I guess that's how I ended up thinking about it. But that was, you're absolutely right, that was part of the unsettling. That was part of the, I mean, much easier to write about a figure like Odetta.
That's why I was wondering, right before you're with such a queer person in presentation, and then you entered this line, that line's so great, womanizing as a form of liberation. But that's every cad you've ever known has argued it that way.
Right, no, exactly,
Right.
exactly.
Right.
Yeah.
But can you talk about the fact that in the Rat Pack, and maybe I'm wrong about this, there was something really infantilizing about the way they treated Sammy Davis.
Oh, totally.
And then his response oftentimes is an expression of masculinity. And when you think about the things that he loved to do, he was obsessed with guns and the gun twirling and all that stuff, and obsessed in some ways, you know, with his sexuality.
Yes.
You know, as if he was trying to prove something. But I've never seen a moment where anyone in the Rat Pack treated him with respect.
No.
You know.
No, so there's that moment where he says, "I'm going to punch you in the mouth." Right? Which is kind of resorting to something in a kind of masculinist mode. But he never gets the better of them in the way that they get the better of him, like constantly. And that's just written, I mean, it's not, these things are unscripted, which was part of their charm. But they were scripted in the sense that Sammy Davis Jr. was always the butt of the joke. And it was always his job to make everything okay. It was his job to make everything okay for the ensemble on stage, and it was his job to make everything okay for the mostly, almost exclusively white audience, and to speak race out loud in a way that was liberal, but to smooth over any of the rough edges that were exposed in his own treatment. And, you know, one of the symptomatic responses he had was that silent laugh of his, where he would slap his knee and throw his head back, and his mouth would be wide open, but no sound would be coming out at all. And it was a kind of performance of hilarity that was a thin mask of a kind of rage that he never admitted to. You know, he had white friends who were incensed by the way he was treated by the Rat Pack, but he never really spoke out against them in that way. And in fact, at that roast of him that you referenced in 1975, when he takes the podium, all he says is, "When they make this much fun of you, you know they love you."
Right. You know, when you read it on the page, though, because it felt like he was also being ironic. That's what I felt like. But of course, when you see it, I know it's not the case yet.
I thought you were going to show the clip. There's one where Dean Martin picks him up under his
and
arm,
holds him.
Right. He said, "I'd like to thank the NAACP
Right.
for this award."
Right.
Oh boy.
Yeah, that's actually in the book.
Sammy just practically peed himself when he got off the stage there. But and the time on All in the Family, when Archie was driving a cab and he came home and he said, "Oh, I had this famous colored person in my cab, and they left their briefcase and they'd come by the house, and Edith says, 'Oh, give me a hint.' He said, 'Hey there, you with the stars in your eyes.' And she said, 'I didn't know Rosemary Clooney was black.'" And Sammy Davis did something unscripted at the end of the show. Archie wanted a picture taken.
Right.
And
Kiss him, yeah.
kissed on the cheek.
Yeah.
And Carol O'Connor wasn't expecting it, and the look on his face said it all. He was just stunned, and it was hysterical.
Yeah. That's a kind of bookend with the Nixon hug, because it happens in the same year.
Right.
Those two, the Archie Bunker kiss and the Nixon hug happen about 9 months apart. But they captured the bookends of American liberalism in 1973 in a certain way.
Right. Exactly. Anyone else? Any last question? Yes, in the back. Oh yeah, in the back. Go ahead.
Yeah, you just mentioned something I was very curious about. Although Sammy Davis is notoriously very literal, it does seem like irony plays a role somehow in the way that he articulates himself, not only on stage, but just in general, how he's trying to, dance ironically in any sense of the term. Is he playing with the concept of irony when trying to deal with the situation?
That's a great question, and it's a hard one to answer. Here's where I end up. There's this moment in a film called Sergeants 3 where he's doing the bullet dance. People are aiming guns at him and shooting at his feet, and he's dancing, and he's tap dancing.
You should describe the film.
Yeah, so Sergeants 3 it's based on Gunga Din. It's based on the Gunga Din myth. So he's the native who's carrying water for the Empire, but it's been transpositioned. So the Empire is the U.S. cavalry. It's right in the wake of the Civil War, and they're in the Apache lands of the Southwest. And so the conquered, the colonized are the Apaches instead of the Indians, as they were in Gunga Din. He's a freed slave. He wants to join the cavalry. He tries really hard to be accepted by them. He's in this bar, and he's playing the bugle, and he's dancing, and all of these white roughs, mostly cowboys, ex-soldiers, cavalrymen, are around him, and they're jeering, and they're deriding him, and they're shooting at his feet, and they're making him dance, all for laughs. But this is played for laughs in the film. It's played for laughs. The thing that's astonishing about it, this is 1961, I think, this film, 62, 63, 61, 62. That actually happened to Davis when he was in the Army in Wyoming, about 15 years earlier. Somebody actually fired at his feet and made him dance, which he reports that he did. So what do we say about a person who's able to experience that level of violence and then a couple years later or several years later play it for laughs? I don't know what that says about his capacity for irony, but I don't think that he was often being ironic.
Right. Daphne, you're going to have the last word, but before we get to, you have to ask your question. You have a good question. You always, because you're brilliant. But let me say one thing that you know this, but I think it's amazing how the story of particularly Black entertainers and Black artists during World War II, how they have the same story, and how that experience destroyed or could have destroyed them. Whether we're talking about Lester Young, whether we're talking, Harry Belafonte, for example, talks about the violence that he experienced. I mean, I've yet to read, even Joe Louis had his challenges. Yeah. I mean, to read any sort of celebrated figure or artist who went through World War II, which was supposed to be the good war, without experiencing that incredible racism, you know? And if you don't believe me, just look at a soldier's play, which is a soldier story. It really captures what that meant. And I think it's the tragedies that Sammy Davis Jr.'s experience is typical, as opposed to not. Yeah. All these musicians who came through, music was the way out of of surviving that kind of violence, you know. So it's really harrowing to think about that, you know. That's the good war too. Yeah. So Daphne.
I think we should wrap up because this has been so rich. I just was like, this opens a whole nother can of worms, but it also builds on, I think, what you were just leading us through, Robin, which is thinking about the specificities of trauma manifest in Black male celebrity. Yeah. And I'm thinking of everybody from Ben Vereen playing Chicken George in the 70s and being such a hero, you know, talk about Alex Haley and Anna Roots, to performing at Reagan's inauguration
Right.
Yes.
in blackface
Yeah.
as Bert Williams, and a tribute to Bert Williams, to somebody like Kanye or Michael Jackson, and I think like there's a genealogy here that Sammy fits into.
Yes.
And it's a heartbreaking genealogy,
Yeah.
but there are also alternate narratives that we can think about.
Yeah.
Right,
Yeah.
right.
Yeah.
That's something to think about. Well, all I could say is thank you so much for writing this book. Thank all of you for coming tonight. Make sure that, I don't know if you're selling the book or not. Yes, you are. Yes, you can. Well, but either way, you should get this book and read it and share it with your friends. But thank you so much.
Thank you.
Okay.